Mr. Sibal, you have provided something that is often not heard on part 4 of the Constitution. Why is it that the framers of the Constitution stopped short of making this mandatory? And what was the thinking behind that? Because it has provided an escape route out at the very outset. So while distinguished people of the law and public intellectuals, academics like you, writers, have emphasized it, why is it that they did not make it more binding?
That's very simple. You see, you cannot have a mandamus by the court directing the government to remove inequalities of income, for example. You can't have a mandamus. But courts have forgotten that in Article 37, all laws must further the cause of social, economic, and political justice. So you can test a law, right? So yeah. I have no quarrels with the proposition that, look, the court cannot direct a law to be framed to remove inequality or to have a uniform civil code or, for that matter, to protect cows, milch cows. But if there is a law which does not protect them, the court can enforce it. But the court have not started doing it. That's why today I formulated a proposition that in fact these laws can be tested for being contrary to the policies enunciated, which are the objectives of the state, in part 4 of the Constitution. And I think this is the starting point of that conversation, and that is why I raised it.
Have there been any court judgments that provide an entry into this?
Not so far. For example, I give you an example. One of the provisions of the Constitution in Part 4 says that the material resources of the community must subserve the common good, must be used to subserve the common good. Right? That's one of them. Now, the material resources of the community are actually subserving the interest of individuals today. You have people getting all the airports in this country. You have people getting all the ports in this country. Right? There are monopolies being created. Now, how do you then, these are material resources of the community. Take even the telecom sector. Yeah. Spectrum is a material resource which belongs to the people of India. But instead of 10 players or 11 players, we have only two really effective players in the market today. So why can't a law be tested on the grounds of Article 37, 38, 39? Why can't it be tested? We're not asking the court to give a mandamus to ensure that such a law be passed. That can't be done. But if there is a monopoly of resources which belong to the community, the court can say that's not what the Constitution makers envisaged, and we can strike it down on that ground. That step has not been taken so far, and that's why I raised this issue today in this inaugural lecture.
Yeah. Coming to the whip, which this is on political justice, you made a very persuasive case. The freedom of speech as well as freedom of action of elected members of parliament and by extension legislatures, state legislatures, how that has been restricted or suppressed by this practice. Yes, in the US it's not there, but in the UK there is a whip, but the crucial difference seems to be that you can't be disqualified. Right. You can be thrown out of the party or de-recognized. So the argument would be that in the interest of political stability, this was necessary. Otherwise, governments will fall very frequently. And given the corruption in this country, in the political system, you can buy the votes by members of parliament, as has been done through various inducements. So what's the answer to that? What will happen if this were not there? This restriction were not there.
What has happened since it is there?
Yes.
See what has happened. The answer is in that question.
Yes.
That the very things that you're talking about, buying people, is happening despite the 10th schedule.
Yes.
So what will happen in that process is that if there are people who are not bound by the whip, the conversation will take place. Right? You can't buy everybody. I mean, there are 5, 10, 20, 5%, 6%, 10% may be up for sale. Not everybody is up for sale. So you will have a far more democratic way of dealing with legislation and far more informed legislation in the country. Because now nothing is sent to the select committee or the standing committee. Right? Just laws are passed because you have brute majority. So there's no conversation, there's no dialogue. At least in that process there'll be dialogue. This law has failed, that's certain. Whether that will fail or not is yet another question to be answered, but let time will tell.
Since 2014, we have seen a worsening of the situation so far as communal relations are concerned. And you spoke about the nexus between those in power at the center and big business, big capital, also media and so on. Don't you think the coalescence of this communal orientation with unprecedented support from big business in many ways, that is at the root, that is at the heart of what is now seen as authoritarianism, which goes in the name of a majority. I would call it Hindutva authoritarianism, because it's very out in the open. Because it's not that we haven't seen these authoritarian trends earlier, anti-democratic trends earlier. You had the emergency, you have various violations of the values that you spoke about. But this is something new. How different is it? Is it this coalescence that explains this authoritarianism? The kind of
I think it's more than that. Yeah. Coalition is just one part of it. Yeah. The real problem in this is that states which are governed by political parties, the enforcement agencies have collaborated with the state.
Yes.
So if the policeman collaborates with the rioter, right, and the judiciary remains silent, then you will have the 80-20 formula. Well, that's what's happening in this country. So it's much more than the coalescence of those forces. Yeah. It is it's the collaboration of the enforcement agencies, the investigating agencies that present the matter to the court, and the court being unable to do anything about it. And that's the heart of the problem. It doesn't happen in many other states. It only happens in states where the collaboration is complete. But there are, of course, some states where that doesn't happen. So you'll find this only in certain states in India. Or you don't find this mostly in this part of the country.
And the laws that have given unprecedented powers to some of these central agencies.
Oh, that's most dangerous. That's most dangerous. Now, I'll give you an example. You know, in the CBI cannot investigate a case in a state unless the state gives consent. Now, of course, states have started withdrawing consent because they know that they are being persecuted by the CBI at the instance of a political party. But see the Enforcement Directorate. As far as the CBI is concerned, there is a Clause 6. There's a Clause 6 in the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act. There's a Clause 6 which requires consent. Yeah. But under the PMLA, there is no consent provision, which means that the central agency can go into any state in the country without a law relating to consent and investigate anybody they like. And this is exactly what they are doing. I mean, I have done matters where the PMLA, as you know, has come into force in 2005. It became law in 2005. But they are prosecuting people for transactions that happened much before 2005. Much before the even law came into force. And amendments have been passed in the PMLA through the money bill course. In other words, amendments which have nothing to do with the money bill, passed in Lok Sabha, not cleared in Rajya Sabha because they can't be cleared in Rajya Sabha because it's part of the money bill. And those amendments now say that you can prosecute a man under the PMLA for what happened prior to 2005. And courts are not willing to decide those matters. That's why I said that the whole system there is a breakdown of our constitutional system. It's a complete breakdown.
A lot of the accountability, it appears, can be placed at the door of the higher judiciary in this country. Would you agree with that?
No, I think that, no, it's not, no, I think that the judiciary must share the blame for not taking up matters. But the judiciary is not that hard the problem. The problem lies with the political system as it has been created after 2014. If you capture all institutions and they become captive to you, and bureaucracy, which is supposed to stand up and say the right thing to the political powers that be, if they are chosen to do the diktat of the government, so the bureaucracy is actually a collaborator, the investigating agency is a collaborator, the university system become collaborators, right? And goons run universities and enter universities. And universities are no longer centers of academics, right? But centers of political influencing. Then there is no hope, because wealth is created in the university system. Wealth is not created by industry. Wealth is created through ideas. And ideas happen in the university system. So if a university moves away from ideas, right, and become war zones in which ideologies take center stage, there will be no wealth creation in this country.
On the judiciary again, you mentioned the much acclaimed order of the Supreme Court of Pakistan at a crucial moment, how quickly they acted and so on. Would you like to, you've studied the order, would you like to say something about that? And if you like, any contrast with our situation?
Tomorrow I'll be trolled, you know that, if I say something.
Okay, we won't go into that. Turning to another subject which hasn't figured today much, center-state relations and the idea of federalism such as it is in the Constitution. It has been raised powerfully in this state by the Chief Minister and the ruling party, as well as some others. The assault on federalism designed by the Constitution. States have been dealt with under the Constitution. Would you like to?
Yeah, you see, I think that, first of all, I don't think we're a truly federal country. It's not a federal structure. It's not a federal constitution. It's quasi-federal. It's mostly unitary because the powers, financial powers, are controlled by the central government. And therefore, what happens is that the states never get their share. The real problem, according to me, because when the Constitution was framed in 1950, when we adopted it, it really was, in a sense, structured on the basis of the 1935 Act, where the colonial power used to control through governors. That system continued. Now, the problem is that most of the subjects which should be in the state list are now in the concurrent list. For example, I'll give you an example of education.
Best.
Education is a subject in the concurrent list. So the central government now can pass a law and say, okay, we'll have a central test, for example, CEC or whatever it is, for entry into university system. Yet another burden, because the diversity of education in this country is so large that it's impossible for equity and justice, as we are talking about, are Siamese twins. In the absence of justice, in the absence of equity, there can be no justice, and there cannot be equity without justice. Right? That's the reality. Now the question is, how do you bring equity into the system? You have, for example, a NEET exam.
Yes.
Right? And Tamil Nadu is very much against it, and so am I, personally.
And you're former minister in charge of that.
Yes, I was, yes. And no, but I didn't introduce the NEET.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's right.
So the point is, how does a state board, living in functioning under the state board, how does he compete? I mean, all the curricula is based on CBSE. And this happens all over the country. It's not just Tamil Nadu. I personally think that education should be a state subject, completely a state subject. I think health should be a state subject. Health and education should be state subjects. Let states compete. We need to amend the Constitution. We need to make sure that panchayats, the finances, devolve on panchayats, that panchayats are in charge of water, about basic necessities of life. I think we must get rid of this colonial structure that we've inherited. under the Constitution, then only federalism will flower. And I think that we can only grow as a nation if we are a truly federal nation.
And India needs federalism more than ever, more than it did at the founding of the Constitution.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the enormous diversity. I always used to say, as a minister, that look, how do I frame a law? Because it cannot apply everywhere.
Yeah.
Because you want to set up schools in Himachal, it's different from setting up schools in Arunachal Pradesh. How do you, and it's different from setting up schools in Chhattisgarh. The topography is different, the challenges are different, levels of poverty are different, teachers are not available in certain states. How do you bring teachers into the system? You can't have education without teachers. We are now delivering education without teachers. This is the sad part. And we think that this digitization is going to solve everything. It's the human touch that matters. It's the values that the child will get that matter.
So before I invite questions, comments from our guests, a lot of people get dispirited. How would you ever overcome this kind of authoritarianism, majoritarianism, electoral success? In the latest round, you saw that. So what's the answer to that?
The answer is people versus. It must be people versus, not political parties versus. People must rise. We must stand up.
But we know that spontaneous movements do well up to a particular point and then dissipate or fade away. You need political organization.
Yeah, it'll come. It'll come. It'll come with the movement. And slowly I see that happening. People are unhappy, but people don't have an alternative. And those who can provide an alternative are choosing not to do so. That's the unkindest cut of all.
Is it because they are demoralized or?
No, I think that the problem with our country is that those who can oppose the government are caught in a bind of a different kind on which I don't want to comment today.
Yes.
And those who cannot fight have no wherewithal to fight. So now it's left to the people. If the main opposition party chooses not to fight and continues in the fashion that it does, then we land ourselves in the situation that we've landed ourselves in.
You touched on media, freedom of speech and expression, and monopolization of mainstream media, or attempts to do that. I think it's still quite diverse, but this tendency is clear. So after the emergency, when there was total suppression, censorship, and so on, this seems to be the worst situation so far as free speech and freedom of the media are concerned. Apart from the killings of journalists,
Yes.
this is often not publicized.
Yes.
But India has been, the Committee to Protect Journalists has focused on India as, you can say, as a founding and permanent member of this club of shame, where journalists are killed in connection with, usually journalists are vulnerable, freelance and so on, but also others are killed. But worse than that is that they seem to have, the impunity index. The global impunity index includes India as one of the dozen countries or so which are permanent members of this. The case doesn't come to any final result. Justice is not rendered in any one of these cases. That's been tracked meticulously by the Committee to Protect Journalists. So would you agree that after the emergency, this is perhaps the most...
No, it's worse than the emergency, if you ask me.
How so?
Because it's captured. That time there were voices that were heard in court.
Yes.
It was not fully captured. Institutions were not captured. This is now, everything is captured. And captured in a very insidious way. And it's very difficult to dismantle it. The stakes are too high.
Whenever freedom of speech or other fundamental rights come into question, are assaulted or allegedly assaulted, when you go to courts, you hear this cry of national security interests. courts seem to be very reluctant to enter into this domain. There are many cases that raise very disturbing questions about what's behind these decisions.
No, I think that it's in Hindi we call it a hawa. National security is just an expression to fob the issue, basically.
Oh.
You see, the question is, I've always been saying this, many of these terms cannot be defined. How do you define equality? Can you ever define equality? You cannot. How do you define freedom? Can you define freedom? You cannot. It's all contextual. And therefore, national security, I mean, has hijab anything to do with national security?
Yes.
Nothing to do with national security. But as you know, freedom of expression can only be curtailed on grounds of national security. How do you, so these are all issues that, you see, that's why if courts are silent on these issues, take sedition law.
Yes.
Can an 80-year-old man who's being prosecuted in the Bhima Koregaon case be a threat to national security? Can Navlakha be a threat to national security? Or Stan Smith, was he a threat to national security? Or Sudha Bhardwaj, for that matter? I mean, how can these people be threats to national security, but they're in jail? Now, if the courts don't do anything about it, what can we do? This is the problem.
So, thank you very much for this insightful and enlightening lecture.